Chapter 12. The Reproductive System. The female reproductive system. The primary sex organs of the female reproductive system are the ovaries, or female gonads. These organs produce eggs, or ova, as exocrine glands and as endocrine glands produce the female sex hormones estrogen and progesterone. The accessory organs of the system are the uterine or fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, and the external genitalia. Some accessory glands also produce mucus for lubrication during sexual intercourse. The female system is more complex hormonally than the male system because it must also nurture the developing fetus during pregnancy. As you can see, this is the organs of the female reproductive system. The ovaries. The ovaries or female gonads are paired glands about the size of unshelled almonds. They are found in the upper pelvic cavity, one on each side of the uterus. They are held in position by a series of ligaments. Suspensory ligaments secure the ovaries to the lateral walls of the pelvis. Ovarian ligaments anchor the ovaries medially. In between, they are held in place and enclosed by the broad ligament, which is a fold of peritoneum. The microscopic view of an ovary reveals that each one consists of a number of parts. The surface of an ovary is covered with germinal epithelium. The capsule of an ovary consists of collagenous connective tissue known as the tunica albuginea. This is divided into an outer area called the cortex of the stroma and contains ovarian follicles in various stages of development and an inner area called the stroma of the medulla. Ovarian follicles are eggs or ova and their surrounding tissues in various stages of development. Each follicle contains an immature egg or oocyte and at this stage is referred to as a primary follicle. As the developing egg begins to mature, the follicle increases in size and develops a fluid-filled central region called the antrum. At this stage the follicle is called a secondary follicle as it begins to develop the fluid. The mature follicle with a mature egg is called a Graafian follicle. This is basically an endocrine gland that begins to secrete estrogen and is ready to eject the mature egg, an event known as ovulation. After the egg ruptures from the mature Graafian follicle, the follicle changes into the corpus luteum, or yellow body, which produces estrogen and progesterone and eventually degenerates to become the corpus albicans, or white body. The function of the ovaries is to produce eggs or ova, discharge the ova in ovulation, and secrete the female sex hormones estrogen and progesterone. The rest of the female system consists of ducts that transport and nurture the egg and, if fertilization occurs, delivers the fetus to the outside world during birth. The duct system consists of the uterine or fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. Oogenesis or formation of the female sex cells or eggs occurs in the ovaries. In males the process is called spermatogenesis and occurs in the seminiferous convoluted tubules of the testes. In males, the process begins in the fetus, continues at puberty, and men can produce sperm throughout their lives. In women, the process begins in the fetus, continues at puberty, but ends at menopause around the age of 50. In addition, the total number of eggs that a woman can produce and release is determined at birth. In a developing female fetus, the female stem cells called oogonia divide by mitosis to produce primary oocytes. They become surrounded by follicular cells in the ovary and are now part of the primary follicles. Around 700,000 are produced at this time and represent the total number of eggs that a female could produce during her reproductive years. They now await further development until puberty. At puberty, the ovarian cycle is stimulated when the anterior pituitary gland secretes follicle-stimulating hormone FSH. Only a small number of primary follicles will grow and develop, with only one egg being released each month. Only about 450 eggs will be produced from the store of 700,000 primary oocytes through the process of meiosis. After the first meiotic division, the primary oocyte becomes two cells. The secondary oocyte is the larger of the two cells. A very small cell called the polar body is non-functional. During the second meiotic division, which occurs only after fertilization, the secondary oocyte and the polar body divide again and the secondary oocyte becomes an oocyte, or mature egg cell, and due to unequal division of the cytoplasm another polar body is formed. The first polar body from the first meiotic division again divides in the second meiotic division to become two non-functional polar bodies. After the second meiotic division, one functional egg cell is produced and three non-functional polar bodies. This is very different from meiosis in men, in whom four functional sperm cells are produced. However, the sperm cells are very tiny with few stored nutrients and will not survive very long because they must get their nutrients from the seminal fluid. The egg cell, however, has lots of stored food because it is a large cell and can't supply the developing embryo until it embeds itself in the endometrial lining of the uterus. As you can see, this is the position of the ovaries, uterine tubes, uterus, and vagina of the female reproductive system. This is a microscopic view of an individual ovary and its internal anatomy. And this is the oogenesis in the ovary. The uterine or fallopian tubes. The female body contains two uterine or fallopian tubes that transport the ova from the ovaries to the uterus. There is a funnel shaft open end to each tube called the infundibulum. This lies close to an ovary but does not attach to it. The infundibulum is surrounded by a fringe of finger-like projections called the fimbriae that partially surround an ovary. Approximately once a month, an ovum ruptures from the surface of an ovary near the infundibulum of the uterine tube, a process called ovulation. The ovum is swept by ciliary action of the epithelium of the infundibulum and by the waving fimbriae, which create a current that carries the egg into the uterine tube. The ovum is then moved along the uterine tube by the action of the cilia and by wave-like peristaltic contractions of the smooth muscle of the uterine tube. If the egg is fertilized, it usually occurs in the upper third of the uterine tube. This means that the sperm must swim up through the vagina, into the uterus, and then up 2/3 of the uterine tube. Fertilization may occur at any time up to about 24 hours following ovulation. If fertilized, the ovum will make its journey down the uterine tube and enter the uterus within 7 days. The uterus or womb is located in the pelvic cavity between the rectum and the urinary bladder. It is held in position by a series of ligaments, and it is the site of menstruation. The uterus is where the fertilized egg is implanted, where the fetus develops during pregnancy, and where labor begins during delivery. It is shaped like an inverted pear and can greatly increase in size during pregnancy to accommodate the developing fetus. It will extend well above the navel or umbilicus in the late stages of pregnancy. Its anatomic divisions include the dome-shaped portion above the uterine tubes called the fundus. Its major portion is the central tapering region known as the body of the uterus. The narrow inferior portion that opens into the vagina is called the cervix. Between the body and the cervix is a small constricted region called the isthmus. The interior of the body of the uterus is known as the uterine cavity. The interior of the narrow cervix is known as the cervical canal. The junction of the uterine cavity with the cervical canal is called the internal os, and the opening of the cervix into the vagina is called the external os. The wall of the uterus is made of 3 layers of tissue. The innermost layer is the endometrium. This mucosal layer is where the fertilized egg burrows into the uterus, a process called implantation. The middle layer of the uterus is called the myometrium, which consists of smooth muscle important during delivery to move the child out of the womb. The outermost layer is the permetrium, made of serous membrane and also known as the visceral peritoneum. When a woman is not pregnant, the endometrial lining of the uterus is shed approximately every 28 days in the process called menstruation. The menstrual cycle, also known as the menses or menstruation, is the cyclical shedding of the lining of the uterus in response to changes in hormonal levels. The cycle varies from woman to woman within a range of 24 to 35 days. To discuss the events occurring during the cycle, we will assume an average duration of 28 days. Events occurring during the cycle can be divided into 3 phases: the menstrual phase, the pre-ovulatory or proliferative phase, and the post-ovulatory or secretory phase. The menstrual phase. This phase is also known as menstruation or menses. It lasts from day 1 to 5. During this time, the thick endometrial lining of the uterus is shed along with tissue fluid, blood, mucus, and epithelial cells. Bleeding during this period can last from 3 to 5 days. The detached tissues and blood exit through the vagina as the menstrual float. During this phase, the ovarian cycle is also in operation. The ovarian follicles, known as primary follicles, begin their development. During the early phase of each menstrual cycle, 20 to 25 primary follicles begin to produce very low levels of estrogen. The clear membrane, the zona pellucida, also develops around the eggs. Later on in the phase at day 4 to 5, about 20 of the primary follicles develop into secondary follicles. These secrete a follicular fluid that forces the ovum to the edge of the secondary follicle. Although a number of follicles begin development during each cycle, only one attains maturity through the process of meiosis. The other follicles undergo cellular death or atresia. The pre-ovulatory or proliferative phase. This phase is more variable in length. It will last from day 6 to 14 in our 28-day cycle. During this phase, only one of the secondary follicles in the ovary matures into a Graafian follicle. This follicle contains the mature egg and will discharge the egg in a process called ovulation. Rising estrogen levels produced by the follicles cause the endometrial lining to thicken during this phase. Ovulation is the rupturing of the Graafian follicle. The ovum is released into the pelvic cavity, and this process occurs on day 14 in our 28-day cycle. After ovulation, the Graafian follicle collapses and blood within it forms a clot called the corpus hemorrhagicum. This clot is eventually absorbed by the remaining follicular cells. Eventually these cells enlarge, change structure, and form the corpus luteum or yellow body. The postovulatory or secretory phase. This phase is the most constant in duration and lasts from days 15 to 28 in our 28-day cycle. It represents the time between ovulation and the onset of the next menstrual cycle. After ovulation occurs, the level of estrogen in the blood drops slightly and secretion of luteinizing hormone LH stimulates the development of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum now begins to secrete increasing quantities of both estrogen and progesterone. The progesterone prepares the endometrium to receive the fertilized ovum by causing it to increase in size and to secrete nutrients into the uterine cavity. If fertilization and implantation do not occur, the rising levels of progesterone and estrogen from the corpus luteum inhibit luteinizing hormone releasing hormone LHRH from the hypothalamus and LH from the anterior pituitary gland. As a result, the corpus luteum degenerates and becomes the corpus albicans. This will initiate another menstrual cycle. If fertilization and implantation do occur, the corpus luteum will be maintained for about 4 months. During this time, it continues to secrete estrogen and progesterone. The corpus luteum is maintained by human chorionic gonadotropin, a hormone produced by the developing placenta. Once the placenta is developed, it will secrete estrogen to support pregnancy and progesterone to both support pregnancy and to cause breast development for milk production in the mammary glands. The length of the menstrual cycle is variable. It can be as long as 40 days or as short as 21 days. It normally occurs once each month from menarche, which is the first menstrual cycle, to menopause, which is the last menstrual cycle. Even though a woman may have a regular menstrual cycle, she may not necessarily be ovulating or releasing an egg. This may lead to problems with fertility and conception. As you can see, this is the menstrual cycle. The functions of estrogen. The ovaries actually produce several types of estrogens. Estradiol, which is the most abundant and is mainly responsible for the effects of estrogen on the body, and estrone and estriol. The ovaries become active during puberty, producing ova and estrogens. The estrogens cause the development of the secondary sex characteristics of a female. In addition to enlargement of the uterine tubes, uterus, vagina, and external genitalia of the female, estrogens cause the development of the breasts and the appearance of pubic hair and axillary hair under the arms. Fat gets deposited under the skin, resulting in the soft look of a female. In particular, more fat is deposited around the hips and breasts. The pelvic bone widens and the onset of the menstrual cycle begins. The vagina has a number of functions. It serves as a passageway for the menstrual flow. It is the receptacle for the penis during sexual intercourse, or coitus. It also is the lower portion of the birth canal. There is a recess called the fornix, which surrounds the vaginal attachment to the cervix. The dorsal recess is called the posterior fornix and is slightly larger than the two lateral fornices and the ventral fornix. The fornix can accommodate the placing of a contraceptive diaphragm, which prevents sperm from entering the uterus. The external genitalia of the female, the reproductive structures located external to the vagina, are referred to as the external genitalia of the female. The term vulva, or pudendum, is a collective term for these structures. They include the mons pubis, labia majora, labia minora, clitoris, urethral and vaginal openings, and the vestibular glands. The mons pubis, also called the veneris, is a mound of elevated adipose tissue that becomes covered with pubic hair at puberty. It is situated directly over the pubic symphysis. From a mons pubis, extending posteriorly and inferiorly, are two longitudinal folds of hair-covered skin called the labia majora. This is the female homologue to the male scrotum. These two folds of skin contain an abundance of adipose tissue and sweat glands. Medial to the labia majora are two other delicate folds of skin called the labia minora. The labia minora do not have hair and have just a few sweat glands, but possess numerous sebaceous glands. The clitoris is a small, cylindrical mass of erectile tissue with nerves found at the anterior junction of the labia minora. There is a layer of skin called the prepuce or foreskin formed at the point where the two labia minora join and cover the body of the clitoris. The exposed portion of the clitoris is the glans. The clitoris is the female homologue to the male penis. It, too, is capable of enlargement by becoming swollen with blood during sexual stimulation and excites the female. Unlike the penis, it does not have an internal duct. The opening or region between the two labia minora is called the vestibule. Within the vestibule is a thin fold of tissue called the hymen, which partially closes the distal end of the vagina. This fold of mucosa is highly vascularized and bleeds when ruptured during the first sexual intercourse. It occasionally is torn during a sports activity or on insertion of a tampon. Also located in the vestibule are the vaginal orifice and the urethral orifice, plus the openings of several ducts coming from the vestibular glands. Posterior to and on either side of the urethral orifice are the two openings of the ducts of the lesser vestibular or Skene's glands. These glands are homologous to the male prostate gland and they secrete mucus. On both sides of the vaginal orifice are the openings of two small glands called the greater vestibular or Bartholin's glands. These glands are homologous to the male's Cooper's glands and also secrete mucus. The mucus secreted by these vestibular glands lubricates the distal end of the vagina during sexual intercourse. As you can see, this is the female external genitalia or vulva. The perineum. The perineum is a diamond-shaped area at the inferior end of the trunk between the buttocks and thighs of both males and females. It is divided into an anterior urogenital triangle that contains the external genitalia and a posterior anal triangle that contains the anus.